Hi folks, this is Jason. Hope you are okay today. It's good to be with you. And we're looking at the historical reliability of the Book of Acts. And so what we're going to do now is I'm going to play you a couple of clips, and then talk about some of the facts.
Majority of scholars who treat Acts as a novel, but most scholars don't treat it that way. For one thing, ancient novels were normally romances, a feature that is notoriously lacking in the Book of Acts. There were a minority of historical novels in antiquity, but never, to my knowledge, and you know, I've read enough that I can say certainly it would have to be extremely rarely, if there are any, of these involved characters within living memory. So not somebody from the very recent past, as we have in the case of the Book of Acts. But another reason that we can't see it as a novel is that there are just too many external correspondences with what we know from ancient history. This is what fits a work of history, not a novel. And of course, one could give very many of these, but just for a handful. Felix was the Roman governor at just the right time that we would expect from the Book of Acts. And although Felix was married to 3 different princesses at different times, the princess to whom he's married in the Book of Acts, Drusilla, was the princess to whom he was actually married at the time that the book was written. Festus and Herod Agrippa I, both act in character with what we know of them. Agrippa II, who's mentioned in Acts.
So, keener on the historicity of the Book of Acts, we'll listen to another little clip of his in a minute. His is he's written a massive work, Book of Acts. Absolutely stupendous book on the Book of Acts. I'll show you the size of it. Okay, here we are. This is the book, 1 volume of the 5-volume work. His bibliography is round about 300 pages. That gives you the size of the giant of the scholar that he is. I mean, he's an absolute giant of a scholar. Absolute giant. And he was once an atheist, but he became a Christian, and he's an evangelical Christian now. What I want to talk to you about is that there are 84 confirmed facts, at least, in the Book of Acts. So when you read the Book of Acts, you will find at least 84. There are many more facts, historical facts. And this is by the historian Colin Hermer, who is an historian of the history of Hellenism, or of Greek culture. And as a historian of Greek culture, he looked at the Book of Acts and was astounded to find that there were lots of historical verification there. And so here are some of these 84 historical facts. I'm going to read about 10, and then we're going to listen to Keener, and then we'll listen to another 10, and we'll listen to Keener. Okay, here are the facts. In Acts chapter 13, verse 4 and 5, the ports are named correctly. The port Perga is directly mentioned in Acts 13:13 from Cyprus, which is mentioned. Lycaonia is mentioned, and it's been verified correctly as in Acts 14:6. In Acts 14:6, an unusual name for Lystria, but is absolutely accurate for the time. Acts 14:11 gets the right language that's spoken in Lystra, Lycaonia. Acts 14:12, right area for the right gods, Zeus and Hermes. Acts 14:25. The proper port for that area is mentioned. Acts 16 verse 1, Acts 15:41. The correct road to Derbe, then to Lystra is mentioned, and the Sicilian gates. Acts 16:8, proper name for Troas. Acts 12:14. Samothrace, sailor's landmark, correctly mentioned. Acts 16:12, correctly stated as Roman colony in Philippi. Acts 12:13, right location of the river Gangites near Philippi. Acts 16:14, Thyatira, a center of dyeing, correctly mentioned. Acts 16:22, correct designation of magistrates of the colony. Acts 17:1, locations of Philippolis and Apollonia, right designation that this would be places where travellers would spend nights. Acts 17:1. Thessalonica, synagogue mentioned 17, Acts 17:1. Proper Greek term, politarchs mentioned in magistrates in 17, Acts 17:6. The right sea travel is mentioned by way of reaching Athens in Acts 17:14-15. Acts 17:6 gets correct the images in Athens. Acts 17:17, correct to state there was a synagogue in Athens. Acts 17:17, correct designation of the philosophical discussions of the time in Athens. Acts 17:18, Paul gets correct Athenian slang. Smerlogos, Arios Pagos in Acts 17:19, showing Athenian character in Acts 17:21. Acts 17:23 is correct about the unknown God. The Greek philosophers reacting the way they did to the bodily resurrection is confirmed from the ancient text of Greek philosophers of that time, Acts 17:32. Acts 17:34 gets the right understanding of a title, Areopagites. Acts 18:4, right designation of the synagogue in Corinth. Acts 18:12 gets the proconsul's state designation in Gallio. Acts 18:16 correctly states the judgment seat or bema in Corinth. In Acts 19:9, in the first century Ephesus inscriptions correctly verifies the name Trinus. Acts 19:24, correct images of Artemis. Acts 19:27, the great goddess Artemis tested historically. Acts 19:29, Ephesians theatre as a meeting place for the city correctly verified. Acts 19:35, the correct title Grammatius, or the chief executive magistrate in Ephesus. Acts 19:35. Proper title for of honor Neokros, stated by the Romans in Acts 19:35. Acts 19:37, correct name for the goddess. Acts 19:38, proper use of word for holding court. Acts 19:38. The anth potari is a double proconsul, two men being proconsul in Acts 19:38, which we didn't realise until recently. So that's an unusual and amazing historical attestation. Acts 19:39. The regular assembly as the precise phrase is attested elsewhere. Acts 24:20 verse 4. Precise ethnic designation Berai Ios. Acts 24 Essainos. Right use of the ethnic term. Acts 27. Implies the strategic disposition of this place of the city of Troas. Acts 20:13 shows how coastal sailing at that time was a difficult place in that area, and is correctly verified, and we see it in Acts 20:13. So we've looked at quite a number of historical facts verified in the book of Acts, and we'll play some more of Kina.
25 and 26 is there with his sister Bernice. Now Bernice only stayed with Agrippa during certain periods of time, and the period of time that Acts gets is exactly the right period. Now these are not the kinds of things a novelist would bother to have researched from what we know of ancient novelists. These are the kinds of things that we would find instead in a work of ancient historiography. One work that actually deals with these correspondences with external history has over 100 pages of this kind of material. Paul's letters are a major source of external corroboration for the book of Acts. You have some differences because, Luke is not Paul, but you have so many correspondences. For example, the names in Paul's circle, not only major characters, like, of course, Peter and so on, but also a wide range of minor characters. The role of Barnabas fits, the role of Silas fits, the role of Timothy fits. Paul being let down from the wall in a basket at Damascus is attested both in Acts and in Paul's own writings. You have a fairly exact itinerary where they both mention the same points, quite a large number of points. Paul is converted near Damascus, and then the rest of his life, Jerusalem, Syria, Cilicia, and the different cities that he visits one after the other. Even Paul's travel plans that are mentioned in Acts 19, where he plans to go to Macedonia, Greece, and then Jerusalem, and then Rome, are also his travel plans and his letters, and how things are fulfilled in his letters. So many correspondences on that level. History was written differently than history today, and of course we can't judge ancient historians by a genre that didn't yet exist. But of course the modern historiography developed from ancient historiography. Even the critical methodologies developed from ancient historians, like Polybius, for example. But ancient historians were very concerned with information, and not only historians, but other writers also. Pliny, Aristotle, Cicero, and so on, spoke of the responsibility of historians to deal in factual information. At the same time, they presented the information differently than we do today. They were more interested in moral or political or even theological lessons. They saw that as part of their responsibility to guide the reader to interpret the events in the right way. So, the fact that we're dealing with interpretive history in the New Testament doesn't make it any less history. That's the way history was written back then.
What a wonderful scholar he is, isn't guy he is. Okay, we have the accurate rendition of the various places in Acts 20, 14, 15. The correct name of the city is Neutra, plural, in Patara, Acts 21:1, Acts 21:3. The right passing route to the south of Cyprus, favoured by various persistent northwest winds. Acts 21:8. The right distance between the cities, Acts 21:24, shows a particular way of having Jewish piety. Acts 21:28. An inscription says, "Let no Gentiles enter within the balustrade and enclosure surrounding it. Whoever is caught will be personally responsible for his consequent death." And that is confirmed by archaeology in Acts 21:28. Acts 21:31. The Roman cohort stationed in the right area. Acts 21:31-35. The steps used by the guards. Acts 22:28. The common way to obtain Roman citizenship. 22:28. The tribune being impressed with Roman rather than Tarsian citizenship. Acts 22:29. Ananias being high priest. 23:2. Felix being governor at the time. Acts 23:34. The neutral shopping point on the way to Caesarea. Acts 23:31. Whose jurisdiction Cilicia was in at the time. Acts 23:34. The provincial penal procedure of the time. Acts 24:1-9. The name Porcius Festus, which agrees precisely with that given by Josephus. Acts 24:27. The right of appeal for Roman citizenship. Acts 25:11. The correct legal formula. Acts 25:18. The characteristic form of reference to the emperor at the time. Acts 25:26. The best shipping lanes at the time. Acts 27:5. The common bonding of Sicilia and Pamphylia. Acts 27:4. The principal port to find a ship sailing to Italy. Acts 27:5-6. The slow passage to Sindus in the fact of the typical northwest wind. Acts 27:7. The right route to sail in view of the winds. Acts 27:7. The location of the fair havens and the neighborhood sites of Lycia. Acts 27:8. Fair havens as ported Roadstead. Acts 27:7. A noted tendency of south wind in these climes to back suddenly to a violent northeaster, the well-known Gregale. Acts 27:13.
And it makes it more edifying. Also, historians were interested in scenes, in fleshing out scenes. For example, in Acts chapter 25, you have Agrippa and Bernice and the Roman governor Festus discussing the case of Paul. Well, Luke wasn't there. How does Luke know what happened? Well, on the next day, they talk about how they discussed this. So the difference between an ancient historian and a modern historian is that an ancient historian might see it as their literary responsibility to flesh it out as a scene. Luke did have information there. It's public knowledge the next day. But Luke can flesh it out as a scene in a way that a modern historian wouldn't feel comfortable doing. When ancient historians used we, they almost always meant, we or I, they almost always meant that they were present when they're describing it within the events of the narrative. Sir Arthur Darby Nock, one of the most outstanding classicists of the 20th century, pointed out that as far as he could recall, there was at most one example in all of ancient historiography where a writer used first person and didn't mean that they were actually present. Now, of course, in novels and so on, you have that, but if it's a historical work, some people have said, well, he wasn't really there when he says we, it's just fictitious. If a person were going to make up their presence, you'd think they'd make it up at Jesus' resurrection or at Pentecost or some major event like that. But Luke implies his presence only when he's traveling with Paul, only when he has to mention himself because he was there. Also, it's geographically isolated. That is, it's not everywhere, not even everywhere that Paul travels. But when Paul travels from Troas to Philippi in Acts chapter 16, at that point, it says we. And then when Paul leaves Philippi, there's no we for many years until Paul comes back to Philippi, and then we picks up again, presumably the author stayed in Philippi. And then we continues through most of the rest of the book of Acts. The final quarter of Acts deals especially with Paul in Roman custody, and Luke was apparently with him during that time. That is a period of at least 2 years. So it gives considerable time for Luke to, and part of it was in Judea, so it gives Luke considerable time to interview eyewitnesses, as he mentions in Luke chapter 1, and considerable time to have talked with Paul and learned about events and experiences that actually preceded even the time that Luke was with him.
So let's look at some more historical facts. The nature of square-rigged ancient ship having no option but to be driven before a gale, Acts 27:15. The precise place and name of this island, Acts 27:16. The appropriate manoeuvre for the safety of the ship in its particular plight, Acts 27:16. The 14th night, a remarkable calculation based inevitably on a compounding of estimates and probabilities confirmed in the judgment of experienced Mediterranean navigators, Acts 27:27. The proper term of the time for the Adriatic, Acts 27:27. The precise term, bolissantes, or for taking soundings, Acts 27:28. A position that suits the probable line of approach of a ship released to run before an easterly wind, Acts 27:39. The severe liability on guards who permitted a prisoner to escape, Acts 27:42. The local people and superstition of the day, Acts 28:40. Verse 4:6. The proper title, Protos tes Nesu, Acts 28:7.
That is precisely the major objection that people have raised against Luke really being a traveling companion and against taking we the way we would take it everywhere else in ancient historiography. People say, well, he thinks differently. But if you compare biographies of ancient figures with the letters that those figures wrote, you have a situation that's very comparable to what we have with Acts and Paul's letters. And the evidence is pretty much the same. You know, people wrote from their own perspectives that could be different from this person's perspective, but it still can include a great deal of accurate information. The differences exist, but they're often exaggerated. One of the major differences that people argue between Paul and his letters and the book of Acts is that Acts presents Paul much more favorably towards the law. But these scholars are arguing from a view that's now been mostly discredited, that Paul was really against the law. That's not the view that most scholars hold. I mean, there are a range of views related to Paul and the law, but most scholars don't hold that Paul was against the law. Most scholars would not hold that Paul is against the customs of his people at this point. Also, when you take a speech like Acts 20, which is in the we material, and it's Paul's one speech to believers, which fits what we have in Paul's letters, there we find considerable correspondences, often even in particular language, even though ancient historians didn't have to get the language just exactly verbatim. That wasn't expected in ancient speeches because you didn't have tape recorders. But sometimes even the language is very similar to Paul's letters. There are differences, but the differences are what we would expect because nobody is saying that Paul wrote the book of Acts. As I mentioned earlier,
so we're coming to the last bit of this. The several liability on guards who permitted a prisoner to escape, Acts 27:42. The local people and superstitions of the day, Acts 20:40, verse 4 and 6. The region as a refuge to wait a southerly wind to carry them through the strait, Acts 28:13. Apai forum or Tres Turbine, a correctly placed stopping place on the Appian Way, Acts 28:15. Appropriate means of custody with Roman soldiers, Acts 20:16. The conditions of imprisonment, living at his own expense, Acts 28:30-31. Now, all the references to the book of Acts there, all the information that I've just mentioned you, have all been verified either by reading ancient text or by archaeology. So when the book of Acts, all those biblical references that I've made of the book of Acts have been verified by historians today, and verifies the text is not in some kind of mythological or make-believe language, but is actually rooted solidly in history. And I hope that you recognize that when you're reading the book of Acts, you're reading an amazing, fair, honest, solid, solid historian. Luke was someone you could trust.
Historians had not just an agenda to provide historical information. They weren't just writing annals or chronicles. Ancient historiography, by its nature, was meant to teach something. It was meant to give moral or political or theological lessons, and we can illustrate all of those from a wide range of ancient historians: Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Josephus, Tacitus, and so on. The Book of Acts, like other ancient historiographic works, was meant to give us information, but not just information. It was information presented in such a way as to teach us something, to teach us how to live. And when you look at the book of Acts, the message there is how God empowered his church to cross all cultural barriers and to bring the good news of Jesus to all the nations. And as somebody who has benefited from that, who was converted to Christianity through other people's witness, I'm grateful for that message. There's a lot of detail in there that's for scholars, but you can isolate that from the main message. I mean, it's structured pretty clearly in terms of headings and paragraphing. So it gives a whole lot of information on each passage, usually on each verse. There's quite a bit of detail. You can extract from that. Obviously, you wouldn't give all of this material in a sermon, but as you're extracting from it, I think you'll find some insights there that you wouldn't get elsewhere because of the great detail that I've tried to go into in reading it in light of other ancient sources.
Okay. Just a little bit of detail about the scholar. Let's give you a bit of detail. The scholar who you heard talking was Keener, an atheist who became a Christian, world authority in some areas of ancient studies of the Book of Acts, for example. So very, very important scholar. But Dr. Colin J. Herman wrote the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history, and he compares archaeological discoveries of over the last 200 years. And he says that it gives 99.9% confidence level in the verification of Luke's writing. He thinks that the book was written about AD 62, which shows a aligned with the conservative evangelicals. He says, Dr. Herman says, Acts is more closely integrated with contemporary events than any other New Testament book. And he criticizes those who would say that he is not accurate. Dr. Herman would criticize anyone who said the Book of Acts is not accurate based on a bias against the supernatural. So that's just a few bits of information about Dr. Herman. I'll see if I can get any more information. Here's a review of Colin J. Herman's Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. In every serious Bible student's library, alongside the introductory works and the commentaries of the Book of Acts, there should be a space either filled by or reserved for the Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history. This work by Colin J. Herman is far-reaching, nearly encyclopedic examination of the history of the Book of Acts from a conservative viewpoint that reopens the question of the reliability of the Acts narrative in the process, fires a warning shot across the bow of the ship called Redaction and the rest of the vessels in the liberal historical critical fleet. The author's purpose in writing is to discover whether Acts can be relied upon as history by using a scientific approach. He strives to establish the history of Acts by appealing to reason and evidence, not faith. Some of the criteria he examines includes the types of knowledge demonstrated in the text, evidence from inconsequential details that correlate with known historical parallels between Acts and the epistles of Paul. And if you type in review of Herman's The Book of Acts in the setting of Hellenistic history, you will find some helpful review of the book. Okay, so the whole point of this exercise is to introduce you a little bit to the scholarship on the Book of Acts. We've introduced you to two scholars, and we've given you some basic facts and information about the Book of Acts. So whenever you see a debate between a Christian and an atheist about the resurrection of Jesus, just remember this video. Remember that there's more to it than the skeptics will allow. That there is much going on in the Book of Acts, for example, than skeptics would actually want you to know about. That basically it's really written as history. Alright? Thank you for listening, and God bless you.